Hello everyone and welcome to Phoenix Gaming. Today we are going to go into an unlocked Frosthaven class guide. That's the Shackles class. So if you're not interested in spoilers, you should stop watching this video more or less immediately. Quick announcement before you do that though, I am going to be doing a Brass Birmingham video for the World Series of Board Gaming very soon. I'm in the process of doing it, but I'm working with someone who's on mountain time and has children, so we have to coordinate that whole thing. But we are getting there. It's going to be awesome. Hope you're looking forward to that. I am looking forward to it myself. Without any further ado, let's start talking about this pretty awesome, very weird unlocked class. What we're looking at here is the Pain Conduit. The Pain Conduit is an Aether, which is my favorite race in Frosthaven or the Haven universe. I think that the lore behind the Aethers is very, very cool. They have this kind of very ethereal nature to them. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing that correct. I'm sure I'm going to get people in the comments who are just very upset about the way that I've said that, but it is what it is. And it's kind of a caster class. Let's see if I can lean in over here. It's kind of a caster class that is mostly about ranged attacks. However, the thing that's funky about this class is you kind of like taking damage, you like taking negative effects, and you can punish yourself to punish your enemies. On the back here, when we're looking at the stats of this class, we see pretty much what I just said there. We're talking about a class that is a ranged class, a control class, and those elemental affinities of fire and wind are, I think, quite accurate. The two of those get used a fair amount, so if you've got people in your party that use these or generate these, it's going to change the way that you're going to wind up playing this class. Obviously, I think the statement about being pretty low on melee is pretty accurate. The rest it kind of puts in the middle and a kind of a middling complexity. I think this is an interesting class to rate as a 3 complexity class. There are play patterns in it that I think are different enough from other classes that I wonder if it sits on the 3 to 4 complexity. But I guess at the end of the day, mostly what you're doing is shooting people for a lot of damage. It's not that the cards are complex, it's that managing what you want to do is a little bit complex. We had to drop the green screen. It was getting too much in our face. We're actually using a red screen today because the color of this class is very blue, which doesn't play well with green screens. So bear with me as some of the things will look a little funnier on video because of that. But hey, that's just the way that it is. So what do I mean by things that are more complex to manage? Well, a lot of the cards in this class essentially say, hey, you should have some negative conditions. It allows you to do X, Y, and Z if you do have these negative conditions. But generally, you still have those negative conditions. For the most part, in any of the Haven games, you're trying to avoid having those negative conditions. So you have a little bit of a more focus me kind of aspect to it. And what's funny about that is that it lends itself to thinking that this character is going to be a tank, and a little bit it is. We will actually talk about that more when we get to the perks. But as far as hit points goes, as a medium hit point class, like it seems like a lot of classes in Frosthaven are so far. I've seen a lot more medium hit point classes versus the meaty HP and the low HP classes along the way. That might just be because of what I've happened to unlock along the way. But to me, it seems like medium is kind of the thing du jour of all of our classes here. So that management and the management of your hit points, actually kind of like Bone Shaper, is something that is going to be a bit of a challenge with Pain Conduit. Pain Conduit was a class that my partner played, not me, so I have observational experience of this class, and then of course just my general Frosthaven what you have it. But that's how we're going to approach this. We're going to look at this starting with first level, go all the way up through the levels, just like we normally do. We're going to break the level 1 cards down into 4 sets, and the very first of those sets is basically us talking about the ranged attacks, which is kind of fundamental to this class as mostly kind of like a caster type of class. And I like this first card because it's pretty indicative of what you do. You do awesome stuff at the expense of something. And so the top of this is a walloping 4 attack at range 3, 2 damage to yourself. This card is really solid. I'll talk about the bottom in a second, but the top of this card is, I think, primarily what you're using it for. A big hit on enemies is pretty good. You generally are getting, I'd say, like compared to most caster classes, probably like a +1 to this attack at the expense of 2 damage to yourself, right? Like I think a default caster would do like a 3 attack at range 3. So that is kind of what you're giving up here. I think given that you have those extra hit points, it's pretty reasonable. I would say that Blood Ritual is like the standard in a lot of ways, like what you can expect to get out of this class. The bottom here gets into the really goofy stuff, and one of the categories we have later is just goofy cards, and the bottom of this is like a goofy card. When an ally gets a negative condition, you can soak it onto yourself, you can soak multiples onto yourself. That's a really neat concept and allows you to do some weird stuff if you're really doing the negative soaking, condition soaking thing. But this is a 10 card class, so if you're using a lost card, it's definitely something that's going to have to do a lot of work. And to me, this is only going to do a lot of work in scenarios where the effects of those negative conditions are really going to hamper your allies. Maybe if the enemies are coming in with piles of disarms or piles of poisons or whatever, and you're like, okay, great, I'm going to take all of them and help us all out. I can see that generating a lot of value. It is probably, as you may well know, much better at 4-player than my 2-player experience. And so we did not use this ability very much in our game. I can see it being pretty spicy in the like combo kind of approach towards playing this class. After this, we've got the Agony of Others. You can't quite see it because of the red screen, but this attack wants a fire element in order to do additional damage, and it's just an attack 2 at range 3, but if you've got that fire element, for every negative condition you have, you can soup this bad boy up. Pretty easy to make this an attack 3. Having 2, 3, or 4 negative conditions on you, I think, is a little bit harder to pull off. But of course, we did just talk about a card where you could maybe just be soaking up your entire party's negative conditions, repeats of the same condition, and this could suddenly become just an absolute mega blast. In our 2-player party, this card did not do a lot of work, and I think it eventually got cut sooner rather than later, but it's definitely got an absolutely huge upside for a level 1 card. You can do more with this than almost any other level 1 card in terms of like its absolute ceiling of what it can do, which is pretty wild for just having a fire. The bottom here, again, kind of is a little goofy, although I think we've seen things like this before, at least in items in previous Haven games. When you take damage, you basically get to make another enemy take the same amount of damage. And the one thing that's true about this that you have to be wary of is on the next 3 sources of damage. So you don't get to control what this looks like. So it could be kind of like a 1-1-2 situation. Obviously, you taking less damage is usually a good thing. This is also going to mean that if you are hurting yourself, you can, that the enemies are going to take a certain amount of damage along the way. Again, for a lost card, you really want something to do a lot. And this can do pretty confidently 6 points of damage. And certainly at higher levels actually becomes even more damage. And 6 is a low amount of damage because I'm expecting that you take 2, 3 times, and you can control that by even the previous card that you played. And this card gives you a whopping 3 experience points if you use the loss ability on the bottom. So I can see this being really pretty gnarly. But again, this is a 10 card class. You got to be really careful about how often you're using those lost cards in terms of your own longevity. But this really can pile on a lot of damage pretty quickly. I see this as being especially powerful in a boss scenario where longevity is not really the thing so much as raw power. Line of Transference is going to be a total workhorse for you in a couple of different ways. One, it's a 25 initiative, which is one of the better numbers on this class. It's not a very fast class in general. You've got that move 4 on the bottom, which gives you a lot of flexibility that you wouldn't normally have. You don't need to do a ton of moving on this class, so when you do, you want to be moving a lot because you're a ranged class. And then the top there is a pretty easy attack 4 to trigger. You just need to have a wind to do it. You get an experience for doing so. And you can make your enemies suffer the negative effects that you have. This is a really neat card in the sense that this card is on any Frosthaven or Gloomhaven class would be pretty nutters. I think this card is really good no matter who you're playing, but it's a little weird in that this is the one class that's like, ooh, do I really want to give up my pain resource, my negative condition, and kind of minimize my other effects? And so you start to see the beginning of like kind of different builds here. There's a little bit more the like, I'll say like the evil healer build along, and then there's sort of the suffering blaster build that kind of, you get that theme in these ranged cards that are coming out. Transferred Injury is a card that my partner really liked. You saw that she upgraded it. It is especially good, I think, in a 2-player party, so you will see why. It allows you to heal an ally, and then for the amount of healing that you do, you get to whap an enemy as well. This quite often, if you have the right elements, is a heal 3, attack 3, which is just a lot of stat block to have on a card. You obviously need the setup to make it work, but the other reason that I put this card kind of next on this list is because we're about to move into healing cards for this class, because this class is about suffering, and what do you do to counter suffering is you heal yourself on the other side. So in the bottom here, being able to do a heal 3 for any of your allies or yourself, and then dropping a wound on yourself is a fine bottom ability. I think a number of classes would be okay with playing that bottom ability, but this class actually can make use of that wound by then on this following turn, giving it away to somebody or adding one to one of your own attacks because you have the wound. So there's a lot actually that you can do with the top and the bottom of this card. And I think that it ended up being a surprising workhorse. Like if you look at the top and you don't have any of the elements, like attack 1, heal 1 is pretty bad. So it's, if you've got everything set up, then you do that. If not, the bottom is completely respectable. The top ability on Cleansing Fire here is, shooting somebody, wounding them, and everyone adjacent to them getting effects. It also generates a fire, which is kind of significant. As we've seen, there's definitely use of the materials here. That being said, I don't think that this card was used for its top very often at all because the bottom is just too good. Healing yourself, moving to, and healing yourself again does so much work on this class. You will have poisons on you, you will have wounds on you, so that one healing dumps them all off and then actually gives you 2 hit points, gets you out of the way, gets you onto a loot. That move on the bottom of this ability does so much work. Cleansing Fire was amazing all the way from beginning until end. The healing hits keep coming. Pleasure and Pain is a card that I think is better 4-player than it is a 2-player. We don't often find, plenty of times we're both hurt, but it's not. Sometimes it's the case that one of us is hurt, the other one's kind of taking a lot of damage, something like that. So while this is on the top, a heal 6 stat block, basically, you do need to position yourself in such a way to make it good. And it just wound up not being as incredible as we thought it was going to be, because heal 6 on paper is a lot of healing. I think that if you have more people in your party, there's a lot more opportunities that you're going to be able to get to trigger this, which I think makes it a better ability. I would definitely try it out because I just think 6 is a big number to see on a card, and you can see the kind of amount of healing that this class has is pretty wild, honestly. Like, it plays very well as a support and a blaster class, and that's, I think, something about it that makes it a very well, maybe not unique, but it's certainly quite versatile in terms of raw numbers. So one thing that I remember thinking was a surprise on the back of its card is that it describes it as having a lot of control, but really what it does is just have big numbers, so I could control enemies by having them dead. The bottom here, I don't love that much. Giving an ally and yourself poison is a pretty severe cost, and making every enemy within 3 suffer a point of damage is fine, but I think in a lot of instances, this is going to end up doing something like 2 to 5 points of damage to enemies, and then give you and an ally a poison, which I think it's a lot here. I think with the move that you have up there, it's not likely that you're going to be very far from your allies so that you don't have to give them the poison. So I would be playing this card primarily for the top ability. I'm sure you could find great uses for that bottom, but I don't think they're going to be so prevalent. Unending Torment, just a big block of healing. That 5 healing for yourself is something that my partner used all the way up until high levels, especially the bottom part of this ability, because you shoot someone at top and then you restore your hit points in the bottom. Can do a lot of work there. You also get to make yourself suffer a little bit to generate an element that you might need for next turn. The disadvantage at the bottom is that probably you're loading up that win so that you can shoot someone next turn, so you are going to have disadvantage. The disadvantage of the bottom is gonna get there, and the top, when muddling yourself is not going to be that bad, so it's entirely reasonable to kind of like use this to move somewhere, heal yourself, immobilize yourself, then your friend goes and opens the door, and then you start shooting bad guys as they come in the room. The fact that this card is the same on top and bottom gives you an interesting amount of versatility in what your other card is, right? there's a lot of times in the Haven games where you set up and you're like, I'm going to play this top and this bottom. And when you're playing in a really clever way, you're going to say, I'm going to play this top and this bottom. If I have to play this top and this bottom, that's okay. And I have a backup plan for it. And this card sort of says, I'm doing this. And now the other card that I play, I want to consider what the top and bottom do. And I actually think that adds, even though it's fewer options, it actually adds to your control over the situation. And so if you know that you need that pile of healing, this card, no matter what the other card you're going to have does, is going to support that. We're next going to move into the summons. Unstable Effigy here is all messed up looking because of the red screen. My partner really tried to make this work. She just thought it was so funny that it kind of like trundled forward and then tried to explode. She really liked the idea of it punishing people. It's fine. I mean, it's very entertaining for sure. It gives you a bunch of experience, as most summons do. And the bottom move is a little funny. I mean, it's a low initiative, which is nice. And you know whether you can kind of move somewhere and then immobilize yourself and set yourself up to attack next turn because you've got ranged attacks. And then you, on the following turn, can then use that immobilize to give it to an enemy or do some damage. So most of the time when you look at a move for immobilize yourself, people are like, ooh, that seems really tricksy. But if there's a class that can make it work, it is this one. So actually the bottom of this card is very respectable, and it gives you a wind along the way. So we already talked about it. Let me pull this card back up. But this card really sets you up, I think, nicely for line of transference on the following turn. It basically is custom designed to run over somewhere, mobilize yourself, next turn, 4 damage, shoot an enemy. They're not going to move either. So the inherent combo that's built with those two cards there is pretty nice. The other enemy or ally that we had was the Scarred Effigy here. I played a character that was a little bit more assassin-y, I guess, and so I didn't want to be taking a lot of hits, and so at times we summoned the Flesh Fiend just to be a big meat sack that was in the way. It does a good job of being a big meat sack that's in the way, because the top ability that you can take the damage that it's taking means that you can kind of just make sure that this extra body is in the way for a while. The problem, of course, with most summons is that if he just stops being able to move in the right places, then he's not doing as good of a job of being a meat shield. I do think this is better at 2-player than it is at 4-player, but it's only okay. The initiative here is also very good. It's kind of funny that both of the initiatives on the summons are quite solid. And the bottom here, a move to retaliate 2 on a caster is not normally something that you want to be doing. This is a class that actually can get away with doing something like this because you might have other abilities now or at later levels that penalize enemies essentially for getting in the mix with you. So you can kind of lean into that theme. I think overall this card is more fun than it is good. I think a lot of the fundamental like blasting stuff does more work in this class. The blasting and the healing stuff does more work on this class than this card itself does. But it is more respectable than I thought it was going to be on paper. All right, now we're getting into the weird cards. And I'll say right up front, the weird cards were a part of this class that we struggled with. I mean, it seemed like setting these things up was very cool, but also over time we just sort of learned like hurting people a lot and healing ourselves a lot seems to just be more straightforward, more impactful. I think the wombo combos you can do with these weird cards are out of control. You just need to set them up correctly. Maybe you'll get in the comments and you'll be like, hey, every single time I had this set up and it worked just fine. Like, it's absolutely amazing. I can see the ceiling on these abilities, but the work that you need to do for them is not little, I think. Again, tell me if I'm wrong, but the combination of many of these lost cards that I see, you know, I could see you putting 4 lost cards into play and going absolutely supernova with this class, but you're going to pass out in about 10 rounds, which isn't necessarily helping your party in the way that I think you need to for most scenarios. So let's dive into it. This ability here lets you take every negative condition you have and just plop it on your enemies. Not the really nasty ones, but the other ones you can. This depends on what negative conditions you've been able to pick up. So probably like wound and poison, pretty default, that you'll sort of like have those and just sort of like be suffering and hopefully not get killed. And then you can just pile that onto all your ranged attacks on enemies. This could be really nasty. Like I could see, so essentially like this could be a 1-card combo where your plan is essentially to get a poison and wound on yourself and then go through the scenario. You don't tank anything. You just kind of support your allies and you slowly bleed to death while you shoot all the enemies and they slowly bleed to death altogether. The bottom of this card is also quite solid. We've seen this already with an attack where you can throw your condition on someone else. The thing is that if you're playing this card, the bottom ability is just a little bit weird in that it's anti-synergistic, right? Like you, in theory, when you play this card, want to be set up to like do all these negative things to enemies pretty much immediately afterwards. But you have, on a prior cycle, used the bottom of this card to give enemies those adjacent conditions. I just don't know that the bottom of this card makes sense with the top of this card, and I wouldn't take this card just for the bottom of this card. So I like the combo potential of the top, but I just think it's a very specific build that you got to consider when you're getting there. Swift Vengeance is a card that we pretty much never use. This card, I think, is a lot nastier when you have a lot of enemies on the battlefield. So having X number of negative conditions you have cursing on people, is not good in a 2-player game. I've already talked to you also about how much I don't like loot in a 2-player game, and that bottom there requires more work than just doing the 1 move there. 3-move loot 1 is really good, but a lot of times we're using that wind to make big attacks on people. So I do think that this card is much more interesting in a 4-player game. Even if you're playing a heavy negative condition build, though, you need to have a certain number of enemies. Those certain number of enemies need to be within range, and you need to have the negative conditions. It's a lot of work to set up the top here. And I think they just got really scared about curses after the Gloomhaven experience. And so these kind of like big curse combo cards require a lot of work to set up, and this is no exception. The Incredible Initiative here is absolutely worth considering. And like I said, if you have the wind, move 3, loot 1, even in a 2-player game is a very good. So I do think that this card deserves some respect. I just don't think that it's going to end up getting played very often in comparison to some of these other ones. All right, Explosive Wounds is a little goofy. This is something that makes one of your allies suffer damage and enemies adjacent to that enemy suffer damage. We tried to use this for a little bit. There was a brief period of overlap where I was playing a tank and it worked okay, but only okay. It wasn't that exciting. And then when I switched into a class that wasn't a tank, this was never really a thing that we wanted to do. And then the bottom of this is really designed for those crazy supernova, I'm going to take all of my allies' negative conditions. If you're doing the take all my allies' negative conditions, I'm assuming that you've maybe put that other kind of permanent card into play that we talked about at the beginning. So this is, I guess, the slower way of doing that. I think that, again, kind of like the first of these, Shared Affliction, the top and the bottom here don't, to me, seem like they jive very much in terms of what it is that they're doing strategically, because I think that this is a class more so than other classes where your strategy throughout the round, like, am I going to be someone who's collecting a pile of negative effects and then doing some big, crazy attacks on people because of that, or giving it to all my enemies because of that? Or am I kind of focusing on like big numbers, big healing? This card doesn't, I think, really fit into either of those game plans especially well. And so if you've had more success with this card, I'd love to hear about it, because we couldn't make it work for us that well. This card, I think, was played like nearly never. You'll notice that, like, as I went through these level 1 cards, there were a bunch of cards I said, I don't know that these were really great. And we struggled with this class at low levels. It was when this class started to level up. The level up of options on this class, I think, are nutters. They're just really good. So if you're having a hard time and you're playing this class at first level, stick with it. You will unlock, and it won't take long to do so. You'll get to knock out a couple of the cards, and you get to kind of decide a little bit more, like, am I going for, like, how do I want to be using my cards? Because I think at first level, this class has bitten off a little bit more than it can really chew. And as you level up, you get to kind of hone in a little bit more on what it is that you want to do with the class, which is one of the cool things about it. So the top here lets you just sort of like dump all of your negative conditions. This is, I guess, like the emergency button if you have like wounded yourself essentially, or if you've done kind of all these negative things to yourself and piled them on enemies, and you need to press the "I need to get out of here now" ability. I guess it's really, really good with that. I take all of my allies' negative effects, then you can kind of play this on the subsequent turn, dump all of them immediately, and then play another card from your hand. So I think that's intended to be sort of the primary combo with this, because that wasn't a big part of our build. We didn't play with the top part of this very much. The bottom ability also very, very funny. I think it is pretty clearly designed, again, for that sort of like supernova where you really want to like punish enemies. You want to collect all these negative conditions, and then you're shooting them at enemies based on the cards that allow you to kind of like transfer these over or make that work along the way. But that's a lot of lost cards. Like, let's take a quick look. So of this class's 13 starting cards, 6 of them are lost cards, and these are the 3 that you would use to go into like the full Insano build, the one that seems very combo-tastic and exciting. It's that top thing that says when you attack, you give the negative conditions to enemies. It's the bottom one on the right here that says you take all the negative conditions for your allies, and it's this bottom one on the left here that says I don't suffer for those conditions on my allies for the next couple of rounds, and I can keep shooting bad guys with it. So like assembling all these together does seem deeply exciting, but also deeply painful. And I don't mean painful in the way that I think the pain conduit's intended to be. I think painful in the way like we're going to get to a certain point in the scenario and it is up to the rest of you to play the rest of this game, because I am dead because I've used all my lost cards. So it's very cool, and I just think that the longevity issue becomes a very, very real problem. Now, there are a few scenes in Frosthaven that are like kind of geared to be like 12 rounds long, and I think when you do those, that's maybe a good time to try this bananas build. But that kind of like arc at the beginning, like I said, was tough for us when we first started this class. But let's look at the level ups. The level 2 cards, I think, are both very funny, and they're very build dependent. I think this is the beginning of what you see as the fundamental difference between the two builds. On the right, we have Reversal of Fate. That top lost card is absolutely amazing. It's 10 stat points plus a bless and a curse, but it is a lost card, right? But that's the kind of card that you want going into the very last room. So extremely respectable. Range 4 is massive. So the question is, are you going to be playing the bottom of this card? And this is sort of like one of the Pain Conduit's builds, which is the I suffer, you suffer thing. And we saw a little bit about that at first level. But making it so that you are bouncing your damage back at enemies can be really good, can be really bad. It's tough to necessarily say, but it does pretty much always work. And there are some enemies that this is better against than it is against others because it ignores shields and things like that. The low initiative is nice too. And the number of times that you need to move on this class, again, is pretty low because it's got decent range abilities, both on its heals and on its attacks. So you'll be standing there a lot, and you can put this into play and then just kind of like sit there until you get hit with it. This is the card that my partner took. I don't think she regretted it at all. It was pretty awesome. Meanwhile, Infection Purge is cool. Again, very high upside, but takes all of that work. You really need to be, on the top here, collecting all those negative conditions. And then you could find 2 enemies and you could do quite a bit of damage to them. You take the damage too. So I said the kind of like you suffer, I suffer thing. This is put in some work in advance to get those negative conditions, have those negative conditions not be killing you, then have 2 enemies within 3 spaces, and all of us are going to take a bunch of fun damage together. It's repeatable, right? So again, the upside of this is potentially very, very cool, but it's a lot of work, and it's something that you need to consider if you've played this class at level 1. You should try to see how many negative conditions can I collect, because originally my partner's plan was to do this like weird negative condition build. I took my other class because we thought that we were going to be like a negative condition party, and turns out that it was too hard to figure out. So by the time we hit level 2, she ended up grabbing Reversal of Fate instead and didn't look back. The bottom of this card is the bottom of the left card, the bottom of Infection Purge, I think is a bad loss card. It's a neat idea for a tanking ability that like I can keep all of my allies alive, but the party still takes a certain amount of damage as a whole, and it being a lost card, I am struggling to imagine why I would be playing the bottom of this card. Maybe in a 4-player game where I'm playing some kind of weird, like, beefy, eat everything kind of build. I can see a weird build using this, but I just don't think it's fundamentally good. So if you're taking Infection Purge, take it for the top. Level 3 kind of continues with the I suffer, you suffer theme. Maybe that's just the class, so I should stop saying that. But here we have Burned at Both Ends, which is the card that my partner took. The top there, on paper to me, looked really bad. Suffer up to 4 damage to make an enemy suffer up to 4 damage, or if you've got fire, you can make them take 2 more damage. I thought that this just didn't seem like worth what it was doing, and boy did she prove me wrong. The number of times where you don't have to draw from your deck and you just guarantee that XYZ enemy with shields dies, so long Flame Demons, I am not concerned about you anymore, is actually pretty cool. There are a lot of times in certain scenarios where it is like, that box needs to die, this certain thing needs to die, like stuff, like things that weren't specific enemies that had specific hit points. A lot of scenarios with objective goals, and this was just like, yeah, I'll take 3 and make sure that dies. I don't want to risk it. I don't want to waste another turn on it. I'm just going to incinerate them and then move on with my life. When we get to perks, you'll also see kind of a little bit more about the hit point game, but it surprised me. On paper, I think this is really bad. I just don't think that it's worth it. But the control, the guarantee is worth something very, very tangible. The bottom of this card is also pretty good. Again, on paper, it looks really bad to me. 3 damage to disarm an adjacent enemy and yourself. First of all, a couple things about this. My partner did not play a build where, you know, it was like remove your things or give the things to the enemies, so you can suddenly make this disarm chain into like multiple disarms. Even still, she used this card plenty. It would be a move 3, disarm herself. She was planning on healing herself next turn anyway, using one of the top cards. So by taking that enemy out and then basically allowing me to just beat them to death, this bottom could end up being really nasty. Making that fire would sometimes come in handy as well. Although I will say oftentimes you use the fire for attacks. So the fact that you're disarmed means that you probably can't use it in the way that you really think so. So I would really treat this card as the move 3 disarm thing. Yeah, again, Burned at Both Ends looks bad on paper to me, but in practice, actually, I was really, really impressed. Reprisal, like heal 2 and put a pile of retaliate in play seems like a funny theme with this class. You don't often want to be retaliating with a ranged class, and this is an initiative 70 card with retaliate on it. So you got to pair it with something that's like low and moves you somewhere. It doesn't seem especially good to me. The bottom ability also is weird because it says when you take damage this turn, enemies are going to take damage too. So again, it's fine ability, but the fact that this card's initiative is 70 for both the top and the bottom means that it needs to be paired with something of a lower initiative. So if you're taking this card, you should be looking at the other cards that you're playing and making sure that you can get underneath what your enemies are doing, because otherwise it's going to be kind of disappointing. Because of that, I don't, and in my experience, I would actually recommend taking Burned at Both Ends. It does something unique that a lot of characters in the Haven games can't do, and Reprisal is just, it demands, I think, it demands of your other cards and doesn't do enough without having a very low initiative. All right, I know I keep switching between which one my partner took, but we're going to start with Down to the Dirt, which is the one that she took. And the reason is that the top of this card is just great. It is not too hard to wait until you're at half hit points, especially when you're punching yourself in the face or letting enemies punch you, to then shoot somebody for 5 points of damage. That's a really, really powerful attack at range. And the bottom, you'll also notice that up until this point, we have had one other move 4 in the entire kit. So having another move 4 in the kit that gives you a little bit of extra kicker health along the way, whether you're the negative conditions build or not, is pretty significant. I do think that the bottom of this, where like the X is the number of negative conditions heal you have, is pretty funny, because if you are stunned, you can't use it. Unless, of course, you use some of your other cheaty abilities. If you're poisoned, then the X is irrelevant. So a lot of these like negative conditions that you're going to have are just going to say, hey, this could just be heal 1, and that would be it. And don't get me wrong, that's fine. A move 4 heal 1 is already good on its own, but I just think that it's a kind of funny. I legitimately wonder if it would be better if it just said move 4 heal 1. Mirrored Misery is a wild card. So the the top of Mirrored Misery is a lost card. So it's got to do a lot of work. And I think it does. You look at an adjacent ally's difference between their hit points and their maximum, it sort of calls back to a little bit of Gloomhaven spoilers, the Berserker class, except for instead of counting my own negative hit points, it counts my allies' negative hit points. And I just think that's hilarious. Honestly, like if you were playing this character up until higher levels, I would take it just for that, because at higher levels you have more hit points, you can get a lot more out of this. Now, we were playing a team that I didn't really want to get hit that much, and I wasn't any tougher than my partner was, so the top of that did not appeal to us quite as much. And then the bottom there is that kind of like collect negative conditions and dump them on enemies build. It's only a move 2 though, so I think that Down to the Dirt is the more straightforward pick here, but Mirrored Misery seems like an awful lot of fun if you have a way of making it work. Level 5 for a lot of classes is the payoff class. I don't think that's necessarily the case with this one, but I do think it's funny that they're both initiative 15, which is better, maybe the best of anything that we've seen so far. Let's take a quick look, actually. We've got a bunch of 20s in here. 15 is the best initiative that we've seen so far. So there's something about that that's respectable here. My partner took Chained by Spite. I'm going left to right, left to right, left to right, and used that top ability a handful of times, because the burned by both ends had impressed her. She took this card because she wasn't using many of the other lost cards that did the kind of negative conditions build. So figured kind of if she throws this into play, I can just keep picking enemies to take damage at the expense of my health over and over again. Again, on paper, that seems really bad to me, but in the right scenarios where you're fighting enemies that are low hit points or even better, high shield, low hit points, this allows you to just kind of like delete people in a way that you normally couldn't. And it's essentially a second attack that you can pile on at the beginning of your turn. So it costs a lot of health. Like you need to be managing your hit points a lot with this class if you're going to use the top ability of Chain by Spite, but it can do a lot of work in the right scenarios against the right bad guys. It's really bad against swarms of guys with hit points that don't do a lot of damage. So you just don't put it into play in the scenarios where you're fighting those people, and instead use the bottom of this card, which is totally okay. Move 3, put a fire into play, retaliate 2 at range, I'll add. Does fine work. It's not the most amazing card by any means, but I think it is a completely respectable card. Chained by Despair is more on the negative condition build. The top of this card, I like the idea of it, right? Like you need these negative conditions. So if you're going to build up your wombo combo, the top of that card lets you build up your wombo combo. However, we already have talked about how many lost cards we need to do these wombo combos, or we really want to be doing to do these wombo combos. So again, the longevity of this kind of build is a really significant part of it. And so you are probably giving up one of those cards that you're using for this one. And without the experience to say which ones do and don't matter, I don't have a confident thing that I could say about it, except for it just seems a little tough. I will say one big advantage of the top of this card here is that you can get one of the perk masteries, I think much easier by having this. And then the other thing to consider about Chained by Despair is that if at this point you've taken all the cards that are like, when you move, give it a negative condition to an enemy, you can kind of just be piling negative conditions on enemies left and right. So that is the control build of this class, right? Is that you do this and you keep taking disarms, like, here, have a disarm, here, have a disarm. Like that allows you to knock enemies or stun even better, knock enemies down in a way that I think no other class can do. But you really need to be built towards that. You can't kind of sort of be in the build, whereas Chain by Spite does allow you to just sort of be however you want to be, as long as you have hit points. The bottom of Chain by Despair, an enemy giving you a negative condition, they get one as well, is respectable, I guess, at a 15 initiative. It's not a card that you're super excited to play. I think if you're taking Chain by Despair, it is for the ability at the top, and you might not use it in every scenario. So I guess you can use the bottom, or you might be, waiting to use it till the mid scenario. So that bottom is like first good to use in kind of like a first round or something like that. But it's not the most exciting card. So if you're taking it, hopefully you know a lot more than I do and you have a plan. Well, we didn't get to level 6 of this class, so I can't even tell you which of these I would take after looking at them. So Hopelessness just banes yourself at the top, which is the dumbest thing that only works on a class like this. I think the intention, I mean, because right, you're going to take this damage, or maybe it's at the end of your next turn that you'll take the damage, but it's essentially, it's saying, look, you bane yourself, and then you play one of those other cards that, you know, moves next to someone and gives them the bane ability. It's one of the easiest ways that you can trigger bane probably the entire game. I think that's pretty, you know, it's essentially an unblockable 10 damage for a lot of bad guys. So if you have those cards, you're running those cards, Hopelessness seems pretty awesome. And frankly, I don't think you even needed to take that many of them. You get them at level 1. So even if you didn't take it as part of your build, there's cards that you can take that give them to enemies anyway. So maybe not with the move part of it. So but you can set it up. It takes only like really one support card to make this card work. It just then says you must play these two cards together, or you must play these cards one turn after the other. And I did learn this from my other class, but baning bad guys is good because 10 damage is a lot. But it also, you know, you're going to get hit by them. So it's not as good as just taking them out on the spot. So is a bane for 10 damage as good as a 5 damage attack? Tough to say. Depends totally on the enemy. If they're a high hit point enemy, of course. The bottom here, move 6 and 4 damage to yourself, seems like quite the pain, but hey, sometimes you need to move 6. I think if you're taking Hopelessness, it's because you're doing the top combo more often. Phantom Limb is a little funny. It is a very nice combo with our friend from the earlier level 2, level 3. Level 3, burned at both ends. Suddenly you can start using the bottom of this card, and you can use it the same turn, right? If you use the bottom to move first, or if you kind of use it on a prior turn and you are still disarmed on the following turn. Phantom Limb allows you to hit someone for 5 points of damage. I'm sure my partner would have taken this one to combo with burned at both ends, and making a wind along the way. It's a pretty decent attack. The bottom here, not exciting at 2 players, but the upside of this being at grant all figures whose hit points were increased. Okay. The bottom of this ability, the upside of this in a multiplayer game or a multiplayer game with summons is wild. You can just have a sudden, I mean, this is a straight up like hold the line Lord of the Rings ability that just can do insane stuff if you have the right situation. It seems hard to have the right situation, but because it's a lost card, you can kind of wait till that perfect situation and pull it off. So what you're doing here probably depends on your build. I think that Phantom Limb really requires you to have burned at both ends to be kind of most excited by it. And then Hopelessness can work with a handful of your other cards, but you really are hoping that you took, let's see, you know, Mirrored Misery or the other one along the way. Level 6 was about conditions. Level 7 is just strictly about damage and punishment. Let's talk about penance first. All adjacent enemies suffering 3 or 4 damage, and then you take X, which is the number of enemies, which is a pretty small price to pay, frankly. So basically, every enemy takes 3 or 4, and you take 1 in response to that. You're going at 12, so there's a good chance you have control over what the board looks like. This, again, is probably better at 4 players than it is at 2 players. That guaranteed damage is nice. It sort of depends on if you have other guaranteed damage. The value of guaranteed damage, I think, goes down the more guaranteed damage that you have, because the advantage of guaranteed damage is finishing people off, especially by the time you're at level 7. So if you have a lot of other guaranteed damage, I do think that penance is a little bit weaker for you. The bottom of this is a pretty nice bottom. I mean, you're at 12 and 3 retaliate's pretty nice. Moving 1 is kind of paltry, but you can use this and pile on some incidental damage on people if you're willing to take a few hits along the way. So penance seems solid to me, particularly for that more like tanky pay attention to me build. Reject the Gift is one that just seems fun to me. So first of all, with the 20 initiative, there's a really good chance you can trigger the top of this ability. When you're going to take damage, you don't take it damage, but the enemy suffers it instead. Well, really, any enemy suffers it instead. So, you know, if you know that like big archer is going to attack you and hit you for a bunch of damage, then it might actually ricochet off to someone else. The problem with this is it's totally dependent on what the enemy initiatives look like. So you are hoping that you go before them, but you also don't want to go before them and then get hit by the guy that's doing an attack 2, and then the guy with an attack 8 comes in and slaps you. That hardly feels worth it. So it depends a lot on the context of the room and what kind of enemies are in there. Having a couple of the same, having like a couple big frozen corpses or something like that, probably this is going to do some work for you. But it's hard to control. You're really, really dependent on the enemies. And then the bottom here is not so exciting. Moving 3 and then preventing negative condition. On most classes, I think this would be so much more exciting. It's just that me preventing a condition, I feel like is not as good on this class because I want to take those negative conditions. So I'm really not sure what the call is at level 8. I think that I think that Reject the Gift does enough different things that would maybe be the one that I would try. That top is, it's kind of funny that both of these cards are sort of, I think, for the more tanky, like take damage and then heal yourself builds. And Reject the Gift basically does that all in one package. But if you don't have that guaranteed damage, maybe Penance is where I'd be leaning. I couldn't tell you. I'm realizing that I had a lot more couldn't tell yous than in any other video that I've done, and I just think that's because this is one of the wackier classes. You remember I talked about I didn't think that it was a 3 complexity class. This kind of stuff is why. It's really hard to evaluate these things. You might be like, why are you doing a video about this then? And that's fair criticism, but I did want to talk about it. I do have opinions about the pieces, so hopefully it's been helpful even if I don't have strong opinions or I'm not quite sure what to make of the things. Racked with Pain here. We know that stunning people is just great. It's kind of funny that was a lot more prevalent in Gloomhaven. Here in Frosthaven, you need wait all the way until level 8, and then all you get with it is a piddly wound. You don't even get to do any damage with it. Maybe a brittle along the way. That seems like a fine thing to just kind of shut down an enemy. I think that sort of ability is always valuable and is better in 2-player than it is in 4-player because we have fewer enemies to contend with. And yes, they're tougher at level 8, but that actually means that the stun is even more significant, more impactful at this point in time. Stun also just allows us to stop enemies from doing things like summons and things like that, that Disarm doesn't allow us to do at lower levels. And then the bottom here with a pretty good healing for yourself. I've already talked about how our build was certainly more focused on the lots of hit points, you suffer, I suffer kind of approach. So I imagine that Racked with Pain would have been the card that my partner would have taken. That being said, Wave of Anguish is pretty cool. Attack 6 is a lot of hurt. And you basically get to just plop all your negative conditions onto the enemy unless you have a zillion of them. So there's a really good chance that if you just happen to pick up some negative conditions, you could pass this one over. And then the bottom, move 5, wound yourself is like okay. I think that probably you're taking this card so that you can play the top more often. But you don't have other abilities to move 5, so there's something very nice about that. Both of these cards seem pretty respectable to me. In a 2-player, I probably take Rack with Pain. In 4-player, I'm probably leaning a little bit more towards Wave of Anguish because I think a single stun is not as good in a 2-player game or in a 4-player game. Yeah, I mean, what the hell is this class? We're going to start with Redemption because End of Everything is just too weird. Redemption. So when you take damage, bad guys take damage. We've seen this theme along the way. That's fine. I don't know that I am so excited about this card because it's a lost card. There's a good chance you already have other stuff that does this. That being said, this can really machine gun down enemies if you're being attacked by swarms. But you're level 9, so they have probably a lot of hit points. So that top of that ability doesn't seem so great. I mean, it's good. It is good. Don't get me wrong. But in the context of being level 9, in the context of it being a lost card, I'm not sure that I love that ability so much. The bottom here is just so much text and 3 curses in a line, which is just cuckoo bananas, letting you sort of just reshuffle your decks, remove all your curses, and then give them to all your enemies. That's really funny. I don't know that enemies are more inclined to give you curses at higher levels, so I don't think I've missed anything where this class takes a lot of their own curses onto themselves. And I don't think I've seen a class that takes a bunch of curses onto themselves. So I'm trying to imagine the context in which the bottom of this card is good. So I'm not so impressed by Redemption. It's not a card that when I have a lost card, I want to see what the other side is going to be, but I guess I'm going to be doing it mostly for that top ability, and I just don't think it's good enough at level 9. That being said, I don't know that I want to play End of Everything either. I mean, 25 attack is an absolutely patently goo goo gaga bananas ridiculous amount of attack. Well, you have to die for it to happen. There are a number of scenarios in Frosthaven that say if one player exhausts, you lose. So this card is unplayable in some number of scenarios. It's not a huge number of scenarios, but it's not 0 either. 25 is a lot of attack. I mean, it's well worth a loss card for a 25 attack, right? But you also need to die. Well, it's really not 25 attack. What am I talking about? You need to die in a situation where you're surrounded by 5 enemies. And I'll tell you right now, if you're playing a 2-player game, and you're surrounded by 5 enemies, and you've exhausted, you've lost. There's a really, really little chance that your ally is good after that because you have too many enemies in this room. That being said, this also might be the only card that could win in that situation. So it does something really, truly miraculous. The bottom of that card basically just says, I can do whatever I want to. I go where I please. I walk on water. And so that's a pretty good bottom. I'm taking End of Everything for sure if I hit level 9, just for the meme of the one time that I get to make that top of that card work. But the bottom is totally respectable. And like I said, I wasn't so impressed by Redemption. All right. So it's kind of been a weird guide because there's so much stuff that's so weird about this class, but I think fundamentally, if you're someone who's struggling with the weird, insane combo build, just focusing on big attacks and healing yourself. I take damage, you take damage. You can't go wrong with it. The numbers are big and the numbers are nice, and that's solid. If you are someone who is a little bit weirder and wants to see what you can pull off, by all means, go for that negative condition build. The ceiling of that negative condition build is absolutely bananas. It's just hard to pull off, especially against certain enemies where it's like, yeah, we don't give you negative conditions. You figure it out yourself. When you're fighting Algox, they're not going to help you with that. So that's something you just have to take on a little bit. Speaking of, let's look at some of these perks. I just want to talk about some of the highlights in here. First of all, this one right here that puts 2 curses in an enemy deck is just really funny. It's a funny way of drawing a -2 where you don't feel so bad about drawing a -2. I don't know that this is better than removing a -2 or replacing it with a 0, but it's certainly unique. And I will say that by the time my partner put this one in her deck, I was playing a class that threw a couple of curses on people as well. And so this ended up being really spicy, where suddenly enemies would have 5-6 curses in their deck, and we hadn't really built for it. So if you're building kind of more on the curse muddle side, there's a lot of upside to that change there. I think replacing a -1 with a 0 disarm is just incredible and absolutely should be something that you do. These are obviously just great on their own, just for improving the quality of your deck. We've already kind of talked about cursing. I mean, it depends on how much you like to curse people. If you're drawing a +1, there's a decent chance that you're killing someone. If you kill them, you don't get to curse them anyway. So I'm not so excited by that perk. I don't think that I would be running that personally very much myself. Healing yourself is probably pretty relevant because you're going to be damaging yourself a lot. This one right here, I can't evaluate for you because it is for that really weird negative condition build. I think that it probably can lead to some of the highest, most ridiculous moments in this class. I mean, imagine that you have 3 or 4 of these on you and you use that level 1 card that adds, +1 for your negative conditions, and then you draw this card. Your level 1 attack card that's repeatable might have just done like 10 points of damage. So you can do some very goofy stuff there. The Ace there one of ignore scenario effects and add 2+1 cards is one of the best ignore scenario effects that you can have. So that's well worth your pickup pretty early along the way anyway. These like long resting, short resting ones, I think are really interesting, but I just don't know that you do it enough that I would be choosing that over some of the other upgrades up top. Obviously it's controllable when you have it, but it doesn't seem the most exciting to me. I don't like this one afterwards. When you become exhausted, you get to curse some people. I mean, hey, it's funny to get them to suffer on the way out, but it's at a point in the scenario where you're pretty much at the end, and so you may never even draw those curses. I don't like it. This bottom one I alluded to earlier when I was talking about it is probably the best 2-perk thing I've seen in the game. That is extremely biased because we've mostly been playing lower level Frosthaven, right? Like levels 2 through 5. And plus 5 hit points at levels 2 through 5 is a lot of extra hit points on a class, especially where you are spending your hit points to do damage to enemies. Unlocking this perk was the thing that kind of, I think, made the difference between this class being difficult to play and easier to play for my partner. Let's talk masteries. These are both Goo Goo Gaga's bananas. I think they're probably the hardest masteries I've seen in the game. If you pull them off, you're awesome. You're cooler than me. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you had a nice time talking about the Pain Conduit. Get in the comments. I know there's already a lot of people who are going to tell me I'm wrong about stuff or I'm undervaluing things. This class especially is one that I just really struggled with. So love to hear what you have to say. Thanks, everyone. Ciao.